Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Lupesco. I am the communications officer at Carbon Gap. For those of you who don't know, Carbon Gap is an NGO working to promote the scale-up of carbon removal in Europe. And of course, part of this work involves analyzing and reporting on the current carbon removal policy landscape, which is exactly what brings us here today, as we look to gain a deeper understanding of policy gaps related to carbon removal in the EU and US. So just some housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions that you would like to address to any of our speakers, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer all of the questions at the end of the session. If you would like to dive deeper into any of our comparative analyses, please visit our carbon removal policy tracker at tracker.carbongap.org. And of course, I will drop that information into the chat. So now on to the main event. I'm joined today by Jack Andreasen from Breakthrough Energy, and he oversees Breakthrough's carbon management portfolio and will give us a few opening remarks on the general outlook of the carbon removal landscape. So Jack, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me this morning, or at least morning in the United States on the East Coast. And yeah, my name's Jack. I work at Breakthrough Energy on carbon management policy, both at the federal and state level, and my sort of further background is in the geologic storage side of carbon dioxide. So I think, I'd like to start off sort of broadly looking at the sort of general outlook for the CDR sector. When you look at the market, so much is that we do have markets for CDR, right? Everyone knows it's largely speaking a couple major tech companies that are buying durable forms of CDR. And outside of that, most of the carbon market is sort of awash in incredibly low quality credits, which make up the majority of the volume. And so the market going forward is something that one needs to be fundamentally created in a more robust way, and expanded to volumes that would help us be on track to achieve our climate goals by 2050 and beyond. So I think that realistically, when you look at markets, there's a lot of sort of policy discussions around procurement as a tool, and procurement is a good tool, but procurement isn't a one-stop shop and won't get us to the totality of tons that we need by 2050. I think instead what you're going to see is a sort of mosaic of policies across geographies, both at the international, federal or national level, and then subnational levels with state and even all the way down to cities and localities. And then within each of those different domains, you can look at a bunch of different policies that could outright procure CDR or embed CDR. So at the moment in the United States, the sort of crown jewel of CDR policy that we have really just focuses on one form of CDR, which is direct air capture, and that is the direct air capture hubs program. The notice of intent for that was for the second round was released last Friday, 2 Fridays ago rather. And then the CDR purchase price, which is in flight right now, in the down selection process of who will receive up to it's a totality of $35 million available for that prize, with a $35 million matching from Google. Outside of that, in the United States, there's a lot of discussion around what could be on the forefront for CDR. These are things like carbon dioxide removal in international trade agreements like carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are things like CDR's compliance pathways and low carbon fuel standards. This already exists in California, and late last year was passed in New Mexico. There was language in the New Mexico low carbon fuel standard to include all forms of durable CDR, and a number of other states are considering CDR as a pathway for compliance and low carbon fuel standards. I don't work as much in Europe as I do in the United States. We have a European branch of Breakthrough, and my colleague Maria Elise specializes in CDR policy there. But it's been really interesting to see how Europe is thinking about including CDR into the ETS, while also having national policies like this sort of reverse auction that the Danish government undertook, which could be a model for CDR procurement going forward, not just in the United States, but abroad. And so, yeah, you have sort of the big target of a compliance market like the European ETS, the inclusion of CDR into that. But I think the most important piece of the point that I want to drive across in this opening is we we currently don't have a clear path for demand between now and when these compliance markets that either exist or are in the process of being formed right now, we don't have enough demand to bridge us to when those compliance markets come into play. And so near-term demand is one of the most important things that we can seek to accumulate, whether through private purchases or near-term policy solutions. Finally, I think it's incredibly important as you look at the United States and Europe, given that both of these, the United States, the country, and the continent of Europe, have been a driving force in pushing CDR forward, whether that's the Norwegians and their focus on direct air capture, the Danes, broadly speaking, on carbon management, the UK giving money to DAC and in ports, and across the continent, the understanding that CDR is going to play a critical role going forward. And then the United States, which is in the process of shelling out billions of dollars for direct air capture, and is looking at other ways to integrate CDR across policies at the national and subnational level. And so understanding that there are different political differences between each one of these different geographies, and those political differences manifest themselves in the policies that are able to be passed, right? We understand that contracts for differences are a big or popular policy tool in the UK relative to the reverse auction in Denmark and to tax credits in the United States. And so understanding and getting a clear view of how each one of these policies play out, not just from a political acceptance point of view, but also from an economy of spending point of view, is going to be crucial to ensuring that we get to the multi-gigaton scale that we'll need by 2050. I will wrap up a bit early with my remarks because there are much more interesting people here, and questions are always better than some guy from Nebraska yapping. So I thank you so much for Carbon Gap, Christoph and the team for having me on. It's great to be here, and thank you all of you for listening in and putting your questions into the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jack. So we will now turn to Carbon Gap's own Alexis Dunand, who is joined by Katie Lebling, a thought leader in the sector who conducts research and analysis on scaling carbon removal for the World Resources Institute. So I turn it now over to them.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. And thank you, Jack, for the opening remarks. Very insightful, as always. So yeah, just to situate the project that we will talk about, it's been a project that we've been working on for about a year with Katie and Danielle from the World Resource Institute. This program and project basically analyzes EU and US policy, and it's part of our policy tracker, which is an online tool that features 3 kinds of analysis. The first one is analysis of EU and international policies. The second one is an overview of what each European countries are doing in terms of CDR policy. And the third one is precisely what we're talking about today, so the EU-US comparison. This project was really, as Jack said, to really enable the dialogue between the 2 geographies and also to find best practices and gaps in the 2 policy approaches. For this, we looked at 6 different topics that we will present in a few words, like presenting the key highlights with Katie just now. The first one was on research development innovation funding. Second one on certification and MRV. Third one, CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. We then looked at government procurement, department incentives, and compliance regimes. And as I said, Carbon Gap led the EU assessment and the World Resources Institute. So Katie and Danielle led the US assessment. Now that I gave this small overview, I will let Katie present the first topic on RD&I funding. So Katie, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. As Alexis said, we'll just go through the 6 policy topic areas that we focused on and do a quick summary of kind of the initiative highlight as well as some lessons learned in that area. So starting with research development and innovation funding, and I'll just say here that the title is RD&I, and we usually call this RD&D, or research development and demonstration, in the United States. So within the context of RD&D funding, as Jack already mentioned, the $3.5 billion in funding from the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law to build 4 direct air capture hubs, each at a 1 million ton per year scale, is the highlighted initiative in this context because of the sheer scale of that funding. and the support it will provide for large-scale demonstration, and the expected impact, which is still in progress. The funding is still being doled out, as Jack mentioned, but expected to have huge impacts in terms of supporting the technology development and moving toward more commercial deployment. So we've already seen 1.4 billion of this 3.5 billion awarded to 21 different projects across feasibility, engineering and design studies, as well as construction phase development. And just recently, a notice of intent was released for an additional 1.8 billion of the DAC Hub's funding. So this notice of intent included funding for mid and large scale DAC, as well as infrastructure scaling platforms. And it lowers the scale of removal required for the large scale hub subsection. So, and it also provides more flexibility around what constitutes a hub. And then on the kind of pilot scale, a little bit earlier stage, funding is also being provided through through the $100 million carbon negative shot pilot program, which supports direct air capture as well as other types of CDR approaches. And there's also been increasing annual budget appropriations for research and development, among other sources of funding. So I think the lesson learned here is that this type of public funding is needed to support the range of technology readiness level stages, so development stages from basic research on to deployment, which we'll get to later. And it's really important to meet the industry where it is, which we've seen through kind of the evolving way the DAC Hub's funding is being allocated. And then I'll just quickly mention, so that was the US. In the EU, RD&I funding for CDR is an increasing priority for the next 5 years, and an increase in that funding for CDR is expected. And then at the country level, in Europe, the UK and Germany already have strong RD&I programs dedicated to carbon dioxide removal.
Thank you, Katie. I will go next with certification and MRV. And yeah, I think it's no big surprise that here the main highlight is the EU carbon removals and carbon farming regulation, which used to be called the Carbon Certification Framework, so also CRCF. And yeah, in a few words, this regulation will create a union-wide voluntary certification scheme. It will regulate 4 types of units. The first one is carbon farming, and carbon farming is subdivided into 2 subunits. So short carbon storage in soils and emission reduction credits in soils. Then we have short-lived storage in short permanent storage, in long-lived products, and then we have permanent CDR. And basically, the framework has now been almost agreed upon. It's still at the final stages where both member states and the parliament need to give their final approval. And the next steps are to create methodologies for each specific CDR method. And this is made in collaboration with the EU expert group. So it's a big stakeholder group that convenes different experts in the CDR sector to really create methodologies for each method. So these include DACs, BECs, etc. And the first methodologies should be ready by 2026. In terms of key lessons learned, we see that the CRCF is really the first stepping stone into how to build trust in the market and to really create a long-term foundation for CDR integration into long-term climate policies. This is the first stepping stone, and then we will see many more policies built around that. If we just look at the US as a comparison, MRV has only started to become a focus area recently. If we just look at the major influxes of money that went to RD&I, as Katie mentioned, a small subset of this is increasing direct to go towards CDR MRV. And yeah, for now, there are no federal MRV standards in the US, nor any certification scheme, but that might change very soon. Let's see, or not very soon, but in the future. Now, if we just look at CO2 infrastructure, that includes both CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. The main initiative that we wanted to highlight here is the EU Net Zero Industry Act. This NZIA has been passed and entered into force earlier this year. And this really introduced a world-first obligation on the oil and gas sector to create a CO2 storage capacity. And this is a really nice example of what we call the extended producer responsibility. So basically the polluter pays principle, but a bit boosted in a way. And this target is 50 megatons by 2030 annually. And there might be a 2040 target as well that will come in the future. If we just look at which key lesson we can learn from this, the main one for us is that regulation can really take pressure off public funding if done appropriately. And we believe that the extended producer responsibility is a very nice example of such a way. And that could be applied to other sectors as well, for example, for a carbon removal obligation or topics like this. Now, if we just switch to the US for a tiny bit as well, the US has provided a lot of funding, around 4 billion through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the carbon safe program for CO2 transport and storage. And we see there that there are a few key challenges to CO2 infrastructure scale-up. These include quite a lengthy permitting process, or even though there are some efforts to shorten it or to make it more efficient. And then there are some public perception challenges. For example, there are a few major pipeline projects in the Midwest that have been canceled recently due to local opposition. So yeah, these two remain quite big challenges in the scale-up of CO2 storage infrastructure. And now I'll go back to Katie for government procurement.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of government procurement, the United States Department of Energy's CDR Purchase Pilot Prize is the initiative we wanted to highlight that Jack also mentioned in the opening remarks. So this is the only example we have so far of direct government procurement of carbon dioxide removal. And so it includes $35 million that was provided through the bipartisan infrastructure law, commercial DAC prize, and the effort was directed through FY23 appropriations. So we've also seen an additional 20 million already provided to extend this program, which is great. And so the program currently has 25 semifinalists that have been chosen across 4 different categories. This was announced in May of 2024. So finalists across direct air capture, biomass, carbon removal and storage, weathering or enhanced mineralization pathways, as well as planned or managed carbon sinks. And so among these 25, 10 will be selected for the second phase, where they'll ultimately need to, in the third phase, remove at least 3,000 tons for a prize of up to $3 million. And so I think one thing I just wanted to point out is some of the requirements for the competitors, which can read in more detail, but just a few include things like independent third-party measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MMRV, demonstrating additionality, secure geologic storage, and a path to scalability, and consideration of societal impacts, including development of a community benefits plan for the phase 3 finalists. So I think one of the lessons learned is that even at this relatively small amount of $35 million, government procurement for CDR can send really important market signals that can help spur other purchases and also implicitly show what DOE thinks in terms of quality standards for CDR pathways, as well as requirements for MMRV. And then quickly on the EU side, the EU Commission is starting to think about potential public-private purchasing options, which could be a sort of government procurement scheme. And the Commission plans to host a workshop on this issue in the first half of 2025. And then moving on to the next topic area, deployment incentives. So Jack also mentioned this already, 45Q tax credit in the US, which supports direct air capture at a credit level of $130 to $180 per ton of CO2, and bioenergy with CCS at a credit level of $60 to $85 per ton of CO2. And these credit levels were significantly increased in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, up from a maximum of $50 per ton back then. So pretty significant increases, and other enhancements were made, like changes to add direct pay and reducing eligibility thresholds for capture capacity, which have made the credit more accessible and useful to DAC developers. And of course, 45Q does only support direct air capture and BECCS, bioenergy with CCS today. And there are a lot of other CDR approaches that aren't eligible yet. So I think that there have been some calls for more technology neutral deployment support, as well as for smaller tweaks to 45Q, like indexing to inflation now instead of in a few years. But overall, I think the lesson is that a bankable incentive like this, particularly with the enhancements like direct pay, is really attractive to project developers and makes the US a supportive location for these types of CDR projects. And then quickly on the EU side, in Europe, Sweden and Denmark, in Europe, Sweden and Denmark have both operational deployment incentives, mostly for bioenergy with CCS. In Sweden, the first bidding round for a reverse auction scheme for BECCS will open soon. And in Denmark, the CCUS and negative CO2 emissions fund provide a stable subsidy for some of these CDR methods. Pass it back to Alexis.
Thank you, Katie. And yeah, this is the last topic on compliance regimes. And yeah, we decided to highlight two initiatives from Europe. So the first one is, of course, the UK ETS consultation. Just one thing to note is that the UK treats, they don't talk about CDR, but about GGR, which stands for greenhouse gas removals. So they slightly extend the scope, but they basically put out a public consultation on integration options of GGR into its UK ETS. The public consultation closed during summer, and now the UK government is trying to summarize all the submissions and they will release a response to all these submissions in the coming months. On the European side, on the European Union side, the Commission is mandated to deliver a report by July 2026 on potential options for integration into its own ETS or other options or alternatives. These other alternatives might include something like a removal trading system, but yeah, it's still at quite early stages. But if we just look in terms of lessons learned, our main point here is to really, there is a need to carefully consider the potential integration of CDR into ETS or other compliance regimes type. And this is really one of the key stepping stones that will really propel CDR into the future. So yeah, we need to both carefully look at ETS integration and other types of compliance regimes. In the US, if we just look at that, and this will be my last point, currently there's not a federal level compliance regime. If we look at state level, as Jack already mentioned, there are a few states that include direct air capture as a compliance option in their low carbon fuel regulation. These include California, Washington State, and New Mexico. And yeah, just to mention that DAC is one of the several options to comply to these standards, and it's not an obligation yet. So yeah, this is a key difference as well. And now I will hand back to Lydia for the panel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alexis. A great overview. And Katie, great overview and a very good foundation for what I hope will be an insightful panel. So now I turn it over to Carbon Gap CEO Christoph Beuttler, who will be moderating the panel.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and thank you, Jack, Katie, and Alexis for the opening remarks and the scene setting. Maybe before I introduce the panelists, let me just summarize. So I think in essence, that we need CDR at gigaton scale to get to net zero by the mid-century. And there's currently no clear path to that. And currently the main topic is that we have a demand gap, especially after the turmoil in the voluntary carbon markets last year, which technically doesn't concern CDR, but obviously there is uncertainty and therefore hesitation now in the space. And the scale-up rates we need to achieve to get to this gigaton path are very high, so we mustn't lose time, and therefore we need to think about how we can plug this demand gap, and therefore we want to learn from each other and talk about the different approaches in the US and in Europe. And obviously we also, and this is very important, we need, as Katie said, to meet the field of CDR, or the industry, where it currently is. And for that discussion, I probably have the three best people on the planet with me. So I thank you very much for making time. I know you are all very busy. So we have from the EU, from the European Commission, we have Fabien Ramos, who is a policy officer with a decade of experience in climate policies, and it's, I think, fair to say, Fabien, that you play one of the very leading roles in the European Commission's work on carbon dioxide removal, sustainable carbon cycles, and industrial carbon management. Welcome, Fabien. And then we have to highlight the industry side, we have Dr. Jane Flegal. Jane leads a 1 billion advanced market commitment by Frontiers, and she's also market development and policy lead at Stripe Climate. Prior to joining Stripe, Jane was a senior director for industrial emissions at the White House and held roles in philanthropy. Welcome, Jane. And then we have Noah Deich. Noah is the Senior Advisor for Carbon Management in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the DOE. That's a mouthful. And in his role, he supports CO2 capture, transportation, conversion, storage, and obviously removal. So all the things around CDR and carbon management in terms of, you know, solutions and infrastructure that are needed. And prior to that, Noah founded or co-founded what I would call our sister organization, Carbon 180, over in the US. Noah, welcome, and thank you for making the time. I'm going to be very impolite to start with and give the word not to the guests, but to the hosts on the European side, if that's okay. So turning to you, Fabien, can you provide us with a brief overview of what the EU is doing on deployment incentives? What's the European approach to plugging this demand gap, basically?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Christoph. And what else can I say? Because I think we had an excellent overview from Alexis and Katie on what is going on in Europe and in the US. For the European part, I think you covered everything. You covered the need for trust and what the work we are doing on the CSCF, on certification framework for carbon removal. What I can add on that is, we are coming now very soon with the methodology for permanent removal. So we have actually will come with two methodology, one for what we call bio-CCS and DAX. So it's one methodology addressing together DAX and bio-CCS. We already shared the first draft of this methodology, a quite comprehensive draft with the experts, members of the expert groups that we set. And we'll discuss this methodology on 21st of October, I think, at the expert group. And just after, we'll release publicly this document. And we'll also, and this is not shared yet, but next week we hope to share with the members of the expert group the methodology on biochar also. We went faster than expected on this, and we are happy to also discuss very concrete discussion on that. So I think this is an essential element because, as you said in your overview, in Europe we really wanted to put the focus on the robustness of the carbon removal. We have a trust issue. It's how can I say? We need sometime, unfortunately, sometime too often, the carbon removal by some people involved in the climate policy sphere in Europe are seen as a threat for emission reduction, for mitigation effort, and it has to change. We need to show that it's part of the solution, that it can be done in a very robust way, and this is what we want to do, what we want to achieve with the certification framework. But as you say, it does not stop here, and we are also working on different things. You mentioned the review of some of our policies, the ETS, you mentioned it. You know also that very soon we'll have to come with an update of the climate law. That is a fundamental piece of legislation in Europe, and there will be interesting discussion on that. We'll have new target for the future, in particular for 2040. And with our policy, we'll need to see what is the articulation of carbon removal. And the last point on which I would like to insist is, yes, on financing. I think US gave a very good example on what we need to do when it's about trying to help the early development of carbon removals. And we are also, of course, very much interested to this. And we start the discussion with stakeholders. You mentioned an event that we are going to organize on the financing of carbon removals. We are open to many different solutions. And yes, we have a consultant that is helping us trying to to interview stakeholders, to really get a lot of ideas around that. So if you're interested to share your views with us, please do not hesitate to contact us, and we'll involve you also for this event. So very briefly, this is what we have. Many things going on in parallel, but I think it's a very exciting moment for carbon removal in Europe.
Thank you, Fabien. Turning our eyes across the pond and staying on the government theme, Noah, can you give us an overview of the American approach, and especially maybe make a few remarks around the 45Q tax credit or tax credit in general, and obviously the CDR purchase price. And if you could also weave it in, Fabien alluded to a trust issue or kind of a competition with emissions reductions. How is this tackled over the pond from our perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first and foremost, greatly appreciate the invite. I think the work that you all do at Carbon Gap is incredibly important, and thank you again for putting this on and including us here. I also want to say thank you to Fabien for all of the leadership on the CRCF, and Jane for the leadership on the private sector side. I think here in the US government, we're trying to be a fast follower on both fronts, on the purchasing and the standard side. And your examples and collaboration have been really great. I think, Christoph, well, I'll start by answering your question is when we submitted our long-term strategy to the Paris Agreement, we set a net zero target by 2050. Every single scenario that we ran needed some amount of carbon removal. The exact amount obviously depends on how quickly we decarbonize, and we don't have a clear idea about exactly what sectors will go how fast. And so I think the way that we're thinking about carbon removal here in the US is very much an option framework. How do we make sure that we have the options to scale up carbon removal to the extent that we will ultimately need, given that it's going to be at least hundreds of millions of tons, if not billions of tons here in the US alone to meet that 2050 net zero target? As we start to think about option value, our framework really focuses on innovation. So at the Department of Energy, we launched a carbon negative shot a few years ago. This is really our organizing principle. The design of the program is really focused on a wide range of technologies. We're trying not to pick a single pathway or winner, but rather embrace the diversity of solutions, because we think that diversity will not only help us create a more robust portfolio, enable us to get to our scale targets faster, but also really lean into the fact that the diversity of carbon removal solutions provides a diversity of options for communities across the US and around the world to be a beneficiary of a carbon removing economy of the future. And we think that really only by embedding high quality community benefits from the very beginning of the carbon removal industry will we actually get it to the scale that we need to. Because at the end of the day, these projects are going to happen only with political support. And we think that that political support depends on high quality community engagement from the communities, the workers, and with a high quality environmental protection mindset built into the very fabric of these projects. I think to achieve that end, the subsidy framework that we have in the United States is more heavily focused on direct air capture at the moment, but it's something that I think we have increasing support from our Congress to expand over time. The goal of our work is to make sure that we have carbon removal solutions at the megaton scale within the next few years. And that's going to be a massive leap forward from where we are here in the US. Thousands of ton per year scale is where we're at today. But we think that by 2030, it's very reasonable to get to that megaton scale and then figure out how we scale from there, because we'll have a much better idea of both the magnitude of the need as well as the promise of some of the solutions that we have. I'll also say that we don't have a preferred policy approach, but are rather taking a broad lens at whatever policy frameworks we think can be effective. I think Jack mentioned it earlier on, that 45Q is the policy framework that supports direct air capture. but there are lots of other opportunities to support different carbon removal approaches, likely more at the pay for practice scale when we think about agriculture approaches, as well as making sure that we're not only constrained to the credit-based framework that we have for things like direct air capture. That said, I'll conclude by saying that the voluntary carbon market is one of the areas that we're very committed to supporting advancement in a high integrity way. The administration released principles on high integrity voluntary carbon markets, and we think that carbon removal can play a critical role in delivering highly permanent, additional, and real voluntary carbon credits. We also think that those VCM markets are absolutely essential as a bridge to getting towards compliance frameworks or other types of policy regimes that can scale CDR in the future. And one of the things that we're doing today is investing heavily, not just in the credits ourselves, but in trying to encourage voluntary carbon credit purchasers to buy a small and growing amount of CDR today so that the field can have the financial bridge. And Fabien mentioned this, how do we finance this? We ultimately are going to be predominantly government financed, but in the near term, we need that public-private bridge to get there through voluntary carbon markets and other types of financing mechanisms. So I think it's an exciting time here in the US, and we're hoping to get to a place where we can have a really informed and a burgeoning industry that can be scaled in the coming decades.
Thank you very much, Noah. And I think your last point on the voluntary space provided a nice segue for my question to you, Jane. Jane, you do lead, the world's largest advanced market commitment, and we have very high-profile companies in this fund. And they all don't need to do that. It's all voluntary. So can you maybe take us through why these companies are being pioneers here, and are also going way beyond what would be considered marketing or corporate social responsibility, and maybe allude to lessons that could be useful for governments?
Yes, thank you again, and thanks to Carbon Gap for a great series of reports and what's already been a great event today. I'm going to try to do an interesting and perhaps Herculean task of both describing my enthusiasm for the voluntary market and the role it can play and has played in beginning to scale this important climate industry, and then moving pretty quickly to why it is nowhere near enough to get the world on track to meet its climate goals, and what I think and we think governments might be able to do to ratchet up ambition and make sure that carbon removal is on its best possible trajectory. So briefly, Frontier is a more than $1 billion now advanced market commitment to buy what we consider to be permanent carbon removal. So carbon removal that is durable for at least 1,000 years. And we are spending that $1 billion through 2030. So $1 billion through 2030 in some ways sounds like a lot, but as will become clearer in a moment as I describe the scale of the challenge, it is actually nowhere near close to the scale required here. And as far as motivations for launching Frontier, I think we were motivated by a few basic facts. The first is that the science is clear that the world needs a lot of permanent carbon removal. And to Noah's point, it's almost immaterial whether it's 2 gigatons or 10 gigatons, because we're so far from delivering a gigaton that it's important to realize that we need a huge scale of carbon removal if we're to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Second, carbon removal is very nascent and very expensive today. And third, a major barrier to scaling these technologies and helping them come down the cost curve is a lack of customers. So Frontier is a group of voluntary buyers, companies, who are committed to getting carbon removal on its best trajectory so that the world can achieve its climate ambitions. We sign multi-year, multi-million-dollar offtake agreements with carbon removal suppliers, not to sort of maximize the volume of low-cost tons that we purchase today, but as I said, to enable learning and drive technologies down the cost curve, a bit like what we've seen with other technologies like solar panels and vaccines. And the truth of the matter is that while we are really excited about government action, and I'll say more about that in a moment, without voluntary customers today, there simply would be no meaningful revenue for carbon removal suppliers. And the fact that that's starting to change because of the actions of some of the folks on this panel and in this discussion is incredibly important and exciting. But I just want to sort of highlight that point. So that's really a problem when you think about the scale of the carbon removal challenge. And I think importantly, it's a problem not when we think just about far off gigaton scale carbon removal in 2050, but it is a real problem in the next 5 to 10 years, like the opacity on demand. It is a problem in the next 5 to 10 years. The voluntary carbon market in its entirety, the vast majority of which does not go to permanent solutions, is something like $2 billion a year. There is no world, and no matter how optimistic you are about the voluntary carbon market, that permanent carbon removal demand gets to $500 billion a year every year in 2050, which is what you would have to do if the world needed, say, 5 gigatons of carbon removal every year and we got the cost to $100 a ton. Like, there is no world in which that happens. I think most people will acknowledge that fact. But what I think is really in some ways more important is that to be roughly on track to be delivering 5 gigatons at $100 a ton in 2050, which, like, it may be more or less, but just leave the 500 billion a year out there. We think that the demand in 2030, which is 5 years away, needs to be something like $20 billion a year. And I would posit that getting the voluntary market for permanent removals, which is far less than $2 billion a year today, to 20 billion in 2030 is also probably unrealistic. And what that reveals is that we are going to need much more robust government intervention in the next 5 to 10 year period on the demand side to ensure that carbon removal companies have customers and can begin to scale. I think, as I said, we're really excited as a result of this about what governments are doing. We're seeing a lot of interesting policy innovation in the EU and in the US on all parts of the system related to demand. But I think there's an interesting question and an opportunity about what governments could do to make this even higher impact. So one idea that we've been thinking about is, might it be possible to think about a sort of multi-governmental advanced market commitment for carbon removal that would be matched by private dollars, but would be driven by governmental commitments to buy carbon removal in various ways. And we have lots of ideas about sort of how that might be designed. And we think it would be catalytic, not just in addressing the demand gap directly, but as I said, sort of like crowding in more private sector buyers who are currently sort of confused by the market, don't know what the right standards are, don't see where things are heading. Having the government step in and do this in a more meaningful way, we think can unlock a lot of private capital. A couple of reasons why we think this would be so advantageous, and then I will stop. One, it's sort of the same rationale for Frontier, which is that ensures that carbon removal is cheaper in the future and that it exists at all when countries need it at quite large scale to achieve their NDCs. Second, it allows governments to think more strategically about both sort of cultivating carbon removal industries within their country, capturing a growing share of the market, and capturing the co-benefits of many of these approaches within their own country. It also, to the extent that there was close collaboration with the private sector, would allow governments to leverage the expertise of the private sector to design deployment policies or purchasing programs in whatever way makes the most sense in their geography. And I think 2 more things. One, I think it's a very efficient and high leverage way to use public dollars. You can design these purchasing programs, as Noah knows, so that the money doesn't actually go out the door unless and until the carbon removal has been delivered. And having worked in government myself, I know that, especially in fiscally constrained environments, not worrying about locking up dollars in projects that do not succeed is is a huge benefit of a sort of pay on delivery public funding mechanism. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the big barriers, not just for the private market, but for government deals in the carbon removal space, is just there are a bunch of shared challenges on everything from MRV, and the EU CRCF work is going to help advance this conversation in a very meaningful way. But lots of confusion about what standards are, what high quality means, what high integrity means. How do you think about Article 6? Who needs a corresponding adjustment for what? How do you think about co-claiming across national and corporate ledgers? Like, there are all of these questions. And at the moment, in the absence of governmental coordination on these challenges, individual buyers, individual governments are kind of like on an ad hoc basis trying to tackle some really big issues in an inefficient and probably ineffective way. And so these are all of the reasons we think getting governments even more involved on the policy front, particularly on the demand side, would be super exciting. So thank you again for having me, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Fabien and Noah, for your opening remarks here. And I said at the beginning, the three of you have, probably the three most representative, important jobs for this discussion. But outside of that, you are also one of the most prolific thinkers and experts in the fields, and I'm really happy that we have you here again. And I want to move us to a bit of an open discussion, and I think we've already touched on the things that we should discuss in your remarks. So I think one topic is the transition from the voluntary space, which is the space that has been there first. Obviously it can react quicker to more of a compliance market space, to then take us into the real scale up. The other one is, and I'm going to reiterate that for everybody to again understand the challenge of the scale. So we need to scale carbon dioxide removal to get to 15% of current emissions, which is probably a very conservative estimate of the residual emissions that we will have in 2015. We need to scale at over 15%, 50, excuse me, that's very important, 50% per year, probably in the region of 60, 65. Humanity hasn't done that with many technologies. Electric cars currently scale with 50%, but that hasn't been sustained for almost 3 decades, and that's what we need to do here. And at the same time, we need to get the emissions down, and that's a challenge in itself. But we want to stay on the track of CDR. And then Jane, you have kind of also led us into thinking around, could there be public-private joint purchasing? And I also want to open the floor to, could there be international purchasing? I think that has been also touched upon by Noah and Fabien. I'm just going to throw this out to you and leave it up to you who will take this. Maybe start with the first one. Could there be international joint purchasing of CDR by government? Is that at all a scenario that would be feasible in the near term?
So I'd be happy to jump in on this one. I think sending a collective commitment is absolutely essential and is something that I think is feasible. What Jane raised about making sure that there's flexibility, that each country can support carbon removal in their own way, is also really important. Here in the US, we're unlikely to have an ETS system anytime soon like we have in the European context. Likewise, I don't think it's fair to ask the European context to have a 45Q like tax credit. Similar types of just making sure that we're having a reality-based policy framework. That flexibility is really, really essential. Where I do think there's an opportunity to coordinate most in the near term is really harmonizing the standards that we use for MMRV, making sure that when we say carbon removal, we're all talking about the same thing, and that in order to prove that the carbon removal that happened is the same carbon removal in any geography, you're following a similar set of basic protocols and standards. That's the place where I think it's most urgent in the near term to converge, in addition to simply sending that market signal out there. Because again, making sure that we can pull forward a lot of that voluntary purchasing demand is critical. So I actually think I'll call it the interest is there, the demand is not. Every company we talk to would like to buy CDR and would like to buy high quality CDR. The question is, how can they justify that expense given the cost and the likely outcome that these projects will get to a lower cost in the future? The key is that they won't get to a lower cost unless everyone starts to invest today. And so it's overcoming that collective action problem that I think a government commitment signal will be really, really important to solve, even if the commitment was executed at a national level based on national political situations.
Thank you, Noah. I want to stay on the first point you made and pass the ball to Fabien. When Noah said that it's very important that, you know, if governments come together internationally jointly to co-purchase, it needs to work for each of the entities. How could it work for the EU, Fabien, or could it work for the EU, and if yes, how?
Yeah, no, this is a fundamental question, and yes, we need international collaboration, sure. We need different sources of funding. This is right. And there is different discussion taking place in different fora, and we have to be careful. Well, careful. We have to make sure that we all go in the same direction. Why I'm saying that is that when you talk to project developers in Europe of big carbon removal, I don't want to say companies, but people that are thinking about 1 million tons of CO2 to be removed, when they try to push for their project, when they try to finance their project, they realize that they cannot, only one source of funding is not working, and they need to combine different sources of funding. They need private money, they need public money, and when it's about public money, they need grants from the European Commission, for instance, but there is also, they need state aid from member states sometimes, and there is all this. And sometimes it's not so easy for them to develop a project with all these different sources, because yeah, we want to make sure that the money is well spent, and it's absolutely normal, but it makes, yes, the development of this project very complex and very long, and we need to streamline that. We need to facilitate for these project developers their access to different sources of money. And of course, what you said is very relevant. I think it's the interest of all. The global warming, the quantity of CO2 that is in the atmosphere is a problem of everybody. It's not a European problem, it's not a US problem, and it makes sense to address that in a common way. So to find at international level a structure, a way to do an effort all together on the financing of carbon removals is something extremely important. The exact form that it could take, as Noah said, there is different constraints. There is not everybody has the same kind of policies. We can think about commitment. We can think about different aspects. But we need to have this discussion, and we need to find solution, because too often the signal that we are sending are not contradictory, but not always perfectly aligned. And the private investors, they need clarity. They need to know, I think Jane mentioned the point on corresponding adjustment. They need to know what is possible in the future on this aspect. And okay, maybe there is some approach that they prefer, but at least they need clarity to build their business case on this. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Great. So if we get an international pledge going, I'll be calling you in the future. That's very good to hear. Maybe let's bring the private part, and that's I must admit, the part I understand less well. Obviously, I recently joined Carbon Gap from the private sector, but you know, how can we transition that into government? What are learnings? I'm guessing, Jane, the private sector is the one that has been buying for a while, and therefore you have gathered some ideas. So, but yeah, maybe can you please elaborate on what you think are the important points for governments to take on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, the first thing is that what is needed to get carbon removal to scale, and this goes to what Fabien just said, is that you really need a healthy innovation ecosystem. So just tackling the purchasing or just tackling the R&D or just tackling the standards is going to lead to a road to nowhere. So we need to think much more about how to create a healthy, vibrant ecosystem for carbon removal. And even as a private buyer, what we have learned is that when you're looking at carbon removal suppliers, in some ways, the most important questions are not just about the TEA or the cost curve assumptions, but about what is the policy environment in which these projects are getting built and operating in. So in the same way that the public sector can learn, I think, from how the private sector has been behaving here, the private sector is learning a lot about how the public sector is engaging and thinking about how best to support these technologies. I think one of the things that we've learned that we're really eager to help share with and have been providing public comments to the Department of Energy and European countries as well on is, we have been writing long-term offtake agreements with carbon removal suppliers. So we actually just made at Frontier our contract template public and accessible, noting that public buyers are going to have a different set of considerations and constraints and interests than private buyers do. But I think just trying to enable more learning about what it looks like to write these contracts, what some of the key considerations or modules are in these contracts is something we're very keen to continue to share, not just with other buyers, but with the public sector. Maybe the one other thing I'll say is that part of what we're so excited about, both with the signal we're getting from the EU CRCF and from DOE's pilot purchasing program, is what Noah said earlier, which is, I think in the past, one of the mistakes that policies have made across the board in climate, not just in CDR, is too early of a narrowing on the solution set and not enough technical neutrality. And so even in the US case, like the fact that the 45Q tax credit really only applies to direct air capture and not to the much wider set of carbon removal solutions is a problem for us meeting our climate goals. And so thinking today about how you would design purchasing programs or tenders or subsidy schemes or deployment incentives of various kinds or standards set in a way that can accommodate the fact that these technologies and approaches are nascent. There's going to be a lot of innovation. And as Noah said, we are not going to get to the multi-gigaton scale with one technology alone. So like we need to be both diversifying the risk across investment across a wide range of approaches, but also recognize that we are going to need a range of approaches to hit our climate goals in all likelihood. So we need to be ensuring that. And that's one thing that we've spent a lot of time thinking about our own theses as a buyer, like with a given amount of money, what is the right way to allocate that capital that is like risk adjusted and as catalytic as it can be for the field. And I think there's a lot of learnings, not just that we have, but Microsoft and Carbon Direct and others have in that regard that could help inform government program design.
Thank you, Jane. Turning to the governments again, and obviously, I don't want to get into the discussion of, the EU side is probably building the market, and then the US side is buying down the cost of the technologies, and ask you now, when will we see a compliance market in the US? Let me ask, in your thinking, are there any plans for post stack up and post CDR purchase pilot, even if it's early thinking, paint a picture of the future, what's coming down the line in your view from the US?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way that we think about the initial bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act investments is that they're a down payment on a climate policy of the future, but the down payment does not get you the house. So we have to continue to invest in subsequent policy changes to make sure that we can go post 2030 actually get to net zero. And I think the focus right now is really on execution. How do we make sure that the investments are that they translate into high impact projects that create good jobs, protect the environment, provide opportunities for communities. And then I think it will be clear what types of policies will come next. But the whole idea of this was, how do we get started with innovation and know that in the future, we're going to need some suite of policies that will continue to accelerate decarbonization. And I think specifically for CDR, where there is not a natural market for this, that it will continue to need some policy framework for the indefinite future to get us to the 2050 goals. And so I don't think there's a specific proposal right now about what that looks like. But in the next few years, I think as the execution of these projects that were funded through the initial infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act start to come to reality, we'll quickly move to what is the next suite of policies. And it will depend on the political conditions at that time. But everyone knows that this is not the end, but rather the start of a climate policy framework in the US.
Thank you, Noah. Maybe staying on that topic of, this is the start and then we learn. Fabien, you made it quite clear that, and others, please come in there. You made it quite clear that the European approach is to set the methodology, set the boundaries, and then go in big with the compliance market. You're shaking your head already, so probably yeah, put that right if that wasn't a fair representation. But my question would be, which learnings do you currently most need? What are you after to complete that sort of picture to say, okay, now we're ready to pull out the big tool, the compliance market?
So yeah, first to be a little bit careful on how to phrase this. So absolutely agree. We need to be sure that to make the things right. So that's why we developed the certification, etc., etc. And the ultimate objective is the integration of carbon removal in one way or the other in our policies, in our framework. By compliance market, I will be a little bit careful. I will not say today that we have to fully integrate carbon removal in the ETS by 2030. It's not at all what I mean by that, but we need to find a way to find the right place for the carbon removals in the framework of all the EU policies. And we are looking at different options, as you know, and as it has been presented with the overview of Alexis at the beginning of this panel, we are looking at different options. What kind of things we need, what lessons we can learn from, and what we need to develop more is, I think Jane also mentioned it previously, is that we need to try to optimize the way where we can put together how to leverage private money, private funding with a good spending of public money. I think this is something important, and how we would like, very concretely, we would like to learn more about the experience, for instance, of actors like Frontier, and to see if at the European level we could get some inspiration to help the early stage development of this carbon removal. Because even if today we are in Europe quite open in the integration of carbon removal in our policies, it will give a good signal for the long term that are important, and I fully agree on that. But still, the cost of carbon removal today is very high, and maybe it will be too high to really take off in the next 5 years. And to lower this cost, we need investment, and we need to work together with the private sector for this investment. And we need to see how to do that well. And this is something that we will really like to think through in the very near term.
Christoph, can I just
Sure,
come in here for
go.
a moment? Yeah, one thing I think is really that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, in some respects, carbon removal is not that different from lots of other areas of climate technologies. In some ways it is, but like in this respect, I think I have like a healthy agnosticism, as everyone I think should have, about how carbon removal is going to get to 5 gigatons a year in 2050. Like whether there's some compliance regime, whether there's public subsidies, whether we're buying it like it's a public service, like, and countries are likely to do other things. We do not know. Nobody can know. It's too hard to predict the politics and the economics of this. I think the best like risk management approach that we can take today is make sure that no matter what, we are figuring out which of these technologies can even work at scale, and making them as cheap as possible so that the cost that societies have to pay to clean up our mess is as low as possible in any policy framework. Like we want to get the most carbon removal we possibly can for the least amount of money in 2050. And it will also make, by the way, the politics of getting these policies passed much easier if the technology solution set is less expensive. So it's kind of a no regrets strategy today to do whatever we can to demonstrate these technologies and get them down the cost curve, and remain as agnostic as we can about, you know, what the 2050 policy deployment framework looks like. And maybe one other thing, just to like dig into the weeds a little bit, I think, to be candid, as a buyer, you know, there are these issues about how to think about the additionality of private sector purchases in instances where there is co-funding with public governments is a really big issue for private buyers. Like if buyers are claiming these tons toward their voluntary net zero commitments, these buyers want to be really careful to ensure that that project would not have happened otherwise without their investment. And you know, it's easy to make that case if there's no other funding sources to it. But to Fabien's point, no private buyer alone is going to make these things scale. No public actor alone is going to get these things to scale. So you need to commingle funding, and you need to figure out how to evaluate additionality in that context. And that's really tricky. And that is a huge area of friction in the market today, is sort of like, how do we think about additionality? How are other people thinking about additionality when we know we need both public and private capital to build these technologies? That's like a really core question. And then related to that, this issue of what kind of claims can governments and corporations make on the basis of these purchases is like, you know, we haven't talked much about the Green Claims Directive in the EU, but like there is, you know, in every country where we have done diligence on a carbon removal project, I have had a different conversation about this question. And like, that is, you know, that is very challenging. And again, I think more multi-governmental coordination and conversation about the claims issue and how to think about claims in the context of public-private funding and public-private partnership would go a long way to sort of reducing friction and making it easier for private buyers to enter the market.
And Jane, I think what you're saying is really important and worth highlighting how different that is from the existing climate policy that we have around emission avoidance. What we've heard over and over again today with carbon removals is, yeah, it's expensive today, but all of our policy is designed to make it lower costs in the future. The emission reduction policy frameworks that we have today are all about how do we find the cheapest possible emission reductions now and save those really expensive, hard to abate emission reductions for the future. So it's fundamentally flipping the policy framework that we have on its head in many ways. And we're not thinking about how do we find the cheapest possible ton today, but it's how do we make the cheapest possible ton in the future by potentially investing in the most expensive ton today. And that's why so many of the frameworks that you said about we need to frame this in $20 billion, not in X million tons. I think that's a really important frame shift, and one that is subtle, but I think is the underlying foundation for why we don't know what our policy framework will look like and why we don't know how this will get integrated into ETS systems or tax schemes, because that's a fundamental shift in how we thought about climate policy overall.
Thank you. That's what I meant. This is such an interesting discussion, and I think you just touched on a great point. I'm gonna put you on the spot and ask you one last thing, and I ask you to be very brief, and then I want to turn to the audience and give them a Q&A with you. But you know, in addition to that remark you've just made, out, you know, can you give me the one policy that you would, if you had a magic wand, that you would like to see, with a view to the fact that, yes, we need to flip it on its head, as you said, Noah, but also we are not in a world anymore where we do have the luxury of having a full information to design policies. We need to basically deploy, learn, and design policies as we go along, because we simply don't have the time to wait. Waiting with emissions reductions has got us to the stage where we now need to reduce and remove. So we need to start moving quickly. So with this in mind, 10 seconds each, what's the policy? Starting with you, Jane.
I think a multi-governmental demand commitment where you're sending a loud aggregated signal of government demand and a signal about quality criteria for carbon removal would be my highest priority right now.
Thank you. Noah.
Yeah, and I think the piece of that that's most important is the commitment, that there is no one policy that is right today. The only thing that's wrong is doing nothing. And so to have everybody commit to taking action at some small and growing level, that is the real key today.
Thank you. Fabien.
Yeah, I agree with what has been said. And what I would like to add also is, and I think this is important, about the fact that today we are thinking about some carbon removal solutions. We mentioned some of them because this is where the development is going and what is coming. I talked about BECCS and DACs, biochar, but who knows, maybe by 2030, but after 2040, we'll realize that the most efficient carbon removal is enhanced rock weathering or something else or something on oceans. And we need to put in place a framework that is flexible enough to include all that, to include this the learnings that we'll get in the future. Thank you, Fabien.
Okay, I'll move us into the Q&A from the audience, starting with a clarification question, I think, to Jane. We have a question here. Are Frontier's MOUs with CDR suppliers exclusive in nature? I think that means nature-based CDR solutions. Can you shed a light on that, Jane?
So if the question is whether we purchase from nature-based projects, I refute the premise, which is that we are very intentional at Frontier about laying out a set of criteria that don't divide the world into nature versus engineered. Rather, we focus on criteria around permanence and net negativity and cost and MRV, and any project, whether it's leveraging nature or leveraging technology, or in almost all cases doing both, we're happy to buy from. But again, like, the permanence thing is what makes us, I think, a little unique. Like, we really want to see, for us, we want to buy units of carbon removal that can credibly be claimed as equivalent to a pulse of fossil fuel emissions in the atmosphere, which for us means basically 1,000-year permanence or more.
Thank you, Jane. Question to you, Fabien, with, I think, probably the green claims in mind, but also probably CSCF. Do you see a role for standard setters such as ISSB to have disclosure requirements for companies to disclose their take on CDR? So is there, broadly speaking, is there a role for standards in the voluntary space on CDR, and how is that spilling over into your thinking? Yeah, definitely. On the CSCF, we want to work with the CSCF. We want to work together with the different standards, existing standards, and to find a way. And this is everything about the legislation on the CSCF is on that, is to build and to rely already on existing standards to better develop the future. So what we propose is some requirements. Our methodology are a comprehensive list of requirements that we think are essential for carbon removal, but we want to build, we are building on existing standard, and we rely on existing program or existing certification scheme to implement this methodology and these requirements. So definitely it works together. It's not that we want to replace or whatever. Perfect. Staying on that track, we have a question on going back to Noah's remark about international harmonization. across different nations for standards. I guess for everyone to remark on, but Noah for sure. So we have the EU coming out with the CSCF. Could that be the right framework to go global?
Yeah, from my perspective, absolutely. We need to figure out how to not recreate the wheel here and get to a place where we have some standards that everybody can point to, whether that's CRCF, ISO standard, some sort of IPCC guidance when it comes to the national accounting. I think we just need to figure out how to converge, and there's a lot of good work that has been done, both from governments and from the private sector, that I think can form the foundation for a more unified standard going forward.
Thank you. Know, any do you want to chime in, Jane or Fabien? Good. Well, Fabien, yeah, go.
No. Just to say, very happy to share our experience with the CSCF and what Noah said about IPCC. I think indeed it's also very important. The link towards the future reporting of carbon removal at national level or at country level in IPCC inventories is also very important. Yes.
Thank you. It's October, which means next month is November, which means COP's coming up. And this is not this year's COP, but it's soon. So this is all for you to share your views. What's the likelihood of the next round of NDCs having separate and explicit emissions reductions and removal targets?
This is well beyond the scope of my expertise, and the last thing I'm going to do is opine on anything related to COPs. So maybe one of the other guys on the call wants to take this one.
Unfortunately, I'm not particularly in a different spot there. What I will say is what really matters is the actual commitments that happen. I think a far more important signal than what's formally represented in the NDC is what actually happens. And if governments can commit to that piece and start executing on that in the next year, that will send a far stronger signal than whatever's in the NDCs.
I could not agree more. Not to dismiss the value of expressions of ambition. It's much easier to express ambition than it is to take instrumental action to achieve it. And I would much rather see, for example, the launch of a multi-governmental AMC for CDR in the next year, or at COP or after COP, than some new target setting effort, because we're not on track to hit our targets. So
yeah, it's not either or, but I think we shouldn't put all of our eggs in the target setting basket.
Thank you. Great remarks. And I think if I may offer my opinion here as well, or Carbon Gap's opinion, I think we would do well to be cautious here, because, you know, whoever starts this sets a precedent in a world where we probably don't have all the thinking and all the information that we need for this level. So and the question is, you know, what is this going to move? So I would very much agree that to plug the demand gap now, that's probably an exercise that should be tackled at a later stage. Maybe going to another hot topic we have here in the list. You know, as you are aware, that we recently had a shift to the right, you know, which means a shift away from climate in you know, many European countries overall. In the EU election, although it wasn't that much of a shift, or less than some expected, I would say. So and also, you know, in the US, the discussion has shifted away. So how do you see this evolving, especially with a view that, you know, we have a shift towards you know, industry policy, staying competitive, and you know, we're talking about technologies here. So yeah, Jane, go ahead, you're unmuted.
yeah, a couple of things. One, I think number one, this is why the imperative to accelerate cost declines in CDR is so important. Like in any context in climate, if you reduce the cost of climate action, you have to rely on a lower amount of political will to overcome cost barriers, which is a no regret strategy for all climate solutions, I think. But secondarily, it's also one of the benefits of widening the aperture on the carbon removal solution set. So as long as the carbon removal solutions meet a set of criteria, every country is going to have different capacity to build out a carbon removal industry across different technological pathways. So for example, you may be a country that's quite land constrained and doesn't have the capacity for a ton of domestic clean energy, but you have access to a lot of water. And so some, marine-based carbon removal options might be more plausibly deployed within your country in a way that is not just delivering the global climate benefit of removing CO2 from the atmosphere permanently, but importantly, offering very concrete local co-benefits to communities. So whether that's jobs in new industries or economic diversification more generally, or local air pollution reduction, or improvements in crop yields and agricultural productivity, or reductions in imports as a consequence of some of these interventions. Like there actually are a lot of co-benefits associated with building out the carbon removal industries that I think make the politics of advancing carbon removal policy much better than we have appreciated historically when it's just been framed as like meeting some global ambition. But I'd be interested in what Noah and Fabien think.
Maybe what I can say on this is that, yes, we had recently elections, as you all know, at the level of the European Parliament. And with a shift, some kind of a shift in the different representation of different parties in this parliament. But the ambition is still the same. The president of the commission has been very clear in our political guideline. The clean transition is still the highest priority, net zero transition. But this is true that one of the axes where this commission wants to develop is from the industrial policies to put in place a framework that will help to achieve this transition the best way possible and to support the industry in achieving this position. So I think, the ambition, the objective, the ultimate goal is still the same. It's reaching climate neutrality by 2050, being very ambitious in 2040. We are talking about 90% emission reduction, and to put all the framework in place to be able to achieve that.
And I think from the US perspective, we're still in a place where carbon removal policy is fairly bipartisan or even nonpartisan at this point. And I think a great example of this is the direct air capture facility that's currently under construction in West Texas, where that facility is not being built in a district that anyone would associate with like climate friendly, right? But at the same time, that project is creating thousands of jobs. It's creating long-term investment opportunities to support that local community. And it's being funded by a 45Q tax credits and voluntary corporate sustainability action. And so I think the realities of these projects, the fact that we're making investments into communities across the United States, not just the communities that are particularly climate forward or loud about being in support of climate action. Those realities on the ground matter far more than messaging or the partisanship around the climate space. And so I think regardless of what happens, as long as these projects continue to deliver benefits to communities, and as Jane mentioned, those communities are across a diverse set of geographies, and in many cases are leveraging the workforces in fossil fuel communities that are looking for a pathway to having high quality jobs in a net zero economy, not just in the US, but around the world. That this is a great opportunity and one that I think will continue to transcend the partisanship challenge in the United States if it is done with that diversity and commitment to high quality job creation and environmental protection.
Great. Thank you so much. We are at time. It is now my duty, and I will fail to do this justice in wrapping up. Let me start by saying I've enjoyed this very much, and by thanking all of you for your incredible contributions and obviously your time. I'll start with Fabien's last remark. What is the ultimate goal here? The ultimate goal is to move the world to net zero, or on a path to net zero by 2050, which also means a path to negative emissions, as in removing more than we emit thereafter. And we have identified and talked about a number of gaps or shifts that need to happen in order to do this. Currently, there is a demand gap after we had an incredible phase in the voluntary space that we need to plug immediately to keep the scale up going, both I think in emissions reductions and CDR. And then we have another shift in a few years, hopefully from the voluntary market to compliance markets, and I think we agreed that the compliance market, and this came from Jane, cannot take us to several hundreds of billions of tons in the required time frame. We need to fundamentally shift our thinking in terms of how we approach policy. We have to move away from chasing the cheapest solution to chasing the idea of scaling up a portfolio of solutions that can, amongst or with the help of each other, scale to the volumes we already know we need, which are several gigatons per year every year in 2050. And we will have to design policies that are flexible enough to enable us to learn as we go along and as new information comes in, because we don't have the time to get a clear picture. And for that, we need to deploy and to use Noah's words, it is about the realities on the ground. We need learnings on the ground. We need to move projects forward, but not just for the technologies, but also in a just and fair way for the whole of society. So we have agreed, I think, or we have shown that the best way, probably, and probably this is the first time in human history where we all need to come together as one on the planet to learn on this and to share the load and to probably also divide the work. And we have explored possible ways of doing that by probably joint purchasing of CDR between governments, but also between the private and the public sector. I want to leave us with two thoughts. I find it amazing that I think for the first time in history, we are realizing, and I want to use Jane's companies as an example, that we're not doing this to save the planet. We are doing this to save us and also save our business model and our prosperity, because a stable climate ultimately means stable economies and stable societies, and we need both emissions reductions and removals to make this work. And probably, emissions removals are also a kind of insurance policy for reductions, because it is likely to be hard on that side as well. And the last thing I want to share is, I think ultimately we have to move our thinking away from a thinking of burden and cost sharing to a thinking of opportunity sharing, because these are solutions that can transition our economies away from fossil, Noah said that in his last remark, to a very large extent, and open up new sustainable or green growth areas for us to stay on a path of a climate safe world, or a net zero world in 2050, while still being prosperous. Thank you all for your time. Thank you to the viewers and the listeners out there. And please keep thinking about this space and help us move it forward. Thank you so much. It's been great.